And now, for somebody who needs no introduction, we welcome Amanda to share her homily with us. Thank you, Amanda.
Good morning again. Would it shock you if I told you we are halfway through spring? Wow! And really, until this weekend, I don't actually think we thought spring had really started. I always love being inspired when I write a homily. And up until 2 weeks ago, I was thinking, I really don't know what I'm going to say this morning. And then Dick and Kathy and I went to hear Attila play at First Church as part of their Spirited Jazz. Highly recommended. Great, great fun. And Reverend Shauna does what she calls a homilette. Exactly what it sounds. A little mini homily. And one of the things she said was she was quoting Palmer Parker. Well, other way around. Parker Palmer. Spiritual lessons from the seasons. Aha, I thought, that's what I want to talk about. So if I thought quickly, I'd think, well, okay, there's growing. We can see things growing out the window. Reaching for the light. After a kind of winter hibernation time, we're outside again all of a sudden. Maybe you're noticing the days are longer. The sun rose before 6 a.m. this morning and won't set till almost 8:30 tonight. In fact, the sun won't set until let's get this right. The sun will set past 8 o'clock until the end of August. Isn't that wonderful? Maybe you've noticed the return of the birds and their songs in the morning and throughout the day. Or maybe for you, it's the smell of spring, the flowers and the soil. Even the salty air seems fresher and crisper this time of year. I'm going to ask you a few questions in this next paragraph, and maybe they're things that we can bring to the light when we're chatting in the forum. What do you most anticipate about the spring? We're so lucky to have so many layers of spring in Victoria. For me, it's the snowdrops in January, daffodils and cherry blossoms in February, fawn lilies and satin flowers in March, shooting stars and lady slippers in April, plum and chestnut trees, and maybe even hawthorns in May. What would you put on your list? What's the first harbinger for you of the arrival of spring? I think we're most connected to hope during spring, after a long winter where we really ache for better weather, to be outside, to feel the warmth of the sun on our skin. This spring, I'm sitting with thoughts of how springs will alter with the climate disaster, worrying that these harbingers will not be able to survive the drastic changes that are coming. This year, I'm really mourning those future changes. We have so little rain this spring that we are already precariously close to drought conditions. Out in the rainforest on long hikes, I've noticed just how dry the soil is. And speaking of soil, I love the fact that the word humus, the decayed vegetable matter that feeds the roots of plants, comes from the same root word that gives rise to humility. It's interesting etymology. Humility is the opposite of pride and is defined as a modest view of one's own importance. I think there's a certain humility in spring. We are dusting ourselves off from winter and stepping out into the light of new beginnings. Maybe seeing the fragile new flowers as a representation of our hopes and dreams in the fertile soil all around us. This spring, the cherry blossoms reminded me especially of Brooke and how much he loved those cherry trees. He was the first person to share the story of the cherry trees with me, and maybe you noticed them blooming right outside James Bay New Horizons. Do you know those trees are 80 years old? In 1938, there was a competition for best float in the Victoria Day Parade. And it was the float from the Japanese community that won. And at that time, there was a huge purse for the best float. And the Japanese community was thinking, well, we're so grateful to be living in Victoria. We want to take this prize money and give it as a gift back to those people that have loved us and welcomed us into this community of Victoria. So they thought and pondered and thought and pondered, and finally they decided the most beautiful gift, because they wanted it to be a Japanese gift, would be if they bought 1,100 plus cherry and plum trees of all different varieties. They ended up buying 20 different varieties of cherry and plum trees. And it took years to sort it out because they had to have them shipped over, especially from Japan. They had to be in special conditions so the trees wouldn't die on their long, perilous journey. And then the trees came here, and they planted and planted and planted the trees. There was this spring, and I think it happens every spring, the city of Victoria puts out a cherry blossom blooming map. And if you looked at the map, all you could see were these little flower icons, because it looked like Victoria was in bloom, and indeed it was. But there's a really heartbreaking side to the story. By the time the trees were all planted by the end of 1941, the first year they bloomed was 1942. And by that time, the Japanese community was not able to witness the blooming of their gift because they had all been relocated to the interior because of the war, because they were seen as a threat. I think of this story with great humility. I wonder, did the blossoms make people stop and think about the generosity of the Japanese community? Did it help people perhaps overcome their fear? Did people feel angst to witness the gift of a community that had now been deported away from this community? I'm reminded of this every year. As these trees bloom, what does it mean to you? Will it change how you look at the cherry and plum trees around our city? I asked earlier, what are the harbingers of spring for you, as well as looking for the arrival of various flowers? I spend a lot of time in the forest. This spring I witnessed two magical events. One was watching a family of great horned owls, not the ones in Beacon Hill Park, a family that very few people knew about, and being so lucky to be there on the day that one of them fledged. And this is a remarkable moment because they spend weeks standing on these incredibly precarious parts of the trunk, and they're 30 meters up in the air, and they flap and flap and flap, and you think, oh, here they go. And then they step back into the nest, and then they go out again and flap and flap and flap and flap and flap, and it's just remarkable. And this one early morning, it was still dark out, and I was the only person there. Of course, I had my camera, and I'm watching, and I'm watching, and I'm watching, and then all of a sudden, this owl is on the very top, all by itself. Parents aren't anywhere around, and it flapped and flapped and flapped, and I think quite to some surprise of the actual owl, it started to fly, and it flew in this really erratic pattern, and they landed on the branch of a tree, but the branch was only this big, and it held on, and then it swung upside down, and then it put its claws on the trunk, and now this owl is hanging upside down, and do I help this owl? Well, it's 20 meters up in the air. I can't help this owl, and I don't want to come in between a natural process and wreck it with my human sensibilities of, this owl needs help. Amanda, just let it unfold. So I watched it hang upside down and flap and look terribly uncomfortable, and in a human way, I'm like, oh, it looks like it's terrified. I don't think owls can show terrified expressions on their faces. So it hung upside down for about 10 minutes while I had a quiet heart attack. And then, all of a sudden, it just released itself from the trunk. And I was videoing it, and you can hear me go, because of course I thought the worst. But nature has its way. Just put out its wings like a parachute and drifted down to the earth. And then I have the sweetest little picture of this little fluffy owl face in the ferns, kind of like, oh, I did it! I did it! So I invite you perhaps in the forum to share those magical stories that have happened to you in nature, or perhaps you've read about in a magazine, or perhaps you've seen on a National Geographic special, because I think those are what remind us that this earth is worth saving. It's worth it to go the extra mile to do what we can for climate change. I think this story and others that we'll share today are the ultimate expression of our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Now, I did promise to talk a little bit about Beltane, and I will just for a moment. Tomorrow is Beltane, or May Day. If you happen to go to Clover Point tomorrow at about 5:45 a.m., there will be a group of pagans and Wiccans who will be welcoming the sun. I think they have a maypole, and they will dance, and they will celebrate the day. Beltane is a pagan a holiday. It's one of the 8 Sabbaths and 4 high holy days in the Wiccan year. It falls halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice. The holiday is often linked with fertility. In fact, it's all about fertility. Beltane is a Celtic word meaning the fires of Bel. We think this likely refers back to the Celtic sun god, Belinus. The Celts used to light 2 bonfires, and they would pass their cattle between the bonfires. And at this time in the story, I have huge compassion for the cattle that must have been terrified, but I wasn't there, because the belief was that that purified the herd. Wiccans and pagans were also known to jump over the fire, which was also purifying, but I don't recommend you do this at home. Perhaps you're familiar with dancing around the maypole as a way to celebrate Beltane. A pole is placed in a field with beautiful colored ribbons, and women and girls, and those that consider themselves women and girls, identify as women and girls, choose ribbons, and they create a beautiful pattern of going up and over, and it's a really complicated dance. Now, I'm sure you can figure out the fertility links in this. A pole, women are dancing around it. I don't think I need to go further into that. I can see we're all thinking. As we move into the second half of spring, do we yield to its flamboyance before the scorching days of summer? The effervescence of spring invites us to bloom. We are welcomed into a colorful world of growth and possibility. Perhaps spring can be seen as maybe a sort of potlatch idea in the natural world, a time of giving, of blooming, to perhaps help us appreciate the natural world. Maybe this year to help us draw attention to all that we might lose in the climate crisis. Would we all advocate with more enthusiasm and vigor for big oil to stop if we truly understood the threat to the magnificence of this spring? For now, the gifts of life that are all but withdrawn in winter are given again by nature. Rather than hoarding it, give it all away. There is a paradox here, known in all the wisdom traditions. If you receive a gift, you keep it alive, not by clinging to it, by passing it along. Hence my gift to all of you of the flowers this morning. Spring embodies our principle, the direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. Today, I invite you to know the fullness of spring in your lives, and I ask you to think about what is blooming in you.